A biting wind stung the face like 1,000 tiny needles as the woodsman trudged through the forest, each booted step leaving a print in the freshly fallen snow. He paused, surveying the expanse of white that stretched to the horizon, trees skeletal, their broken branches knuckling through a blanket of frost. It was midwinter, and the world felt as though it had been hushed by the cold, everything swallowed by the hush of swirling flakes, each one dancing like a memory lost to time. He had lived here alone for as long as he could remember, and though loneliness was his companion, it was a familiar, reedy tune that comforted him more than it pained him. Yet today, something tugged at the hollow in his chest, a whisper in the wind that spurred him onward, beyond the usual trail he walked each morning. Snowflakes settled on his threadbare cloak as he followed a faint, winding path where footprints led off into the deeper woods. They were not his footprints. They were brand new tracks, fragile indentations of boot heels, and beside them, the smaller prints of tiny feet. Curious, he pressed on, senses alert, heart swelling with an uneasy thrill. Someone else had entered this desolate realm. He rounded a bend, and there, through the veil of white, he saw them. A woman, ragged and weary, crouched by a smoldering fire that fought valiantly against the cold. Beside her, two children huddled close, their faces pinched with fatigue and fear. Their clothes were tattered remnants, soaked through by the relentless snow, and their eyes that darted with both terror and hope, met his before he could even speak. The world contracted in that heartbeat. The loneliness that had defined him for so long wavered, giving way to something startling: compassion. All at once his legs moved toward them, though he hardly felt their weight. The woman looked up, a frail hope flickering in her gaze, quickly replaced by dread as she realized she faced a stranger. "Please," she whispered, voice cracked like parched earth. "We have nowhere else to go." The smaller child, scarcely more than 4, pressed a grubby hand to his mother's side, while the older one, maybe 7, curled into a ball as though he could somehow disappear entirely. The woodsman's response was a simple nod. He knelt and stirred the embers with a stick, coaxing a brighter flame, and in that glow saw the woman's eyes fill with tears. He slid off his heavy, fur-lined cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders, then held another at arm's length for the children. They shivered violently as he draped the cloth over them, their bodies oddly still, as though the warmth itself was a miracle. His own hands felt the burn of freezing flesh, but he didn't flinch. He only wanted them safe. Moments stretched, time suspended by the fierce cold and the uncertainty that clung to them. Then he spoke, voice low and firm. "My cabin is near. You can stay there until the storm passes." He left no space for refusal. A flicker of relief passed over the woman's face, and she nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. The children glanced at each other, hesitant, before the older one rose slowly and took his small sister's hand. They followed the woodsman through the trees, branches crackling under the weight of snow, shapes shifting in the fading light. At intervals, he paused to clear away fallen branches or steady the woman when her legs trembled. Each time she looked at him, gratitude shone in her eyes, but he felt no pride, only the inescapable tug of responsibility. His cabin appeared suddenly, a shelter of dark timber and stone chimney that whispered promise through curling smoke. A plume of smoke rose above its pitched roof, knitting itself into the overcast sky. Inside, a hearth crackled, soaking the low-ceilinged room with golden warmth. The woodsman ushered them past the simple pine table piled with firewood and blankets, then beckoned them to sit on a rough-hewn bench. Flames danced along the stone wall, revealing his sparse possessions: a single rocking chair, a small cot, and shelves bearing a few meager supplies. The place was lonely, but it was cozy enough for now. He fetched a pot of water and set it on the hearth, stirring in herbs he had gathered that morning. The steam curled in lazy tendrils, and a faint scent of pine and sage filled the air. Slowly, he ladled warm broth into rough mugs and offered one to the woman, who shook so violently that tears pricked her dark lashes. "Drink," he urged gently. "It will help." She brought the mug to her lips and sipped, her body relaxing as warmth spread from her chest to her fingers. The older child, his face streaked with dirt, stared at the mug as though it were gold. The younger one watched with wide, wary eyes. "The Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice raw. "I am Mara, and these are my children, Caleb and Josie." He nodded and introduced himself simply. "Jonah." He paused, then added, "You can stay as long as you need." No explanation, no qualifiers, just a place to rest. The first night was painfully still. Jonah lay in his cot, listening to the wind buffet the walls. But instead of his usual solitude, he felt a kinship to the other cots pressed against the opposite wall, one for Caleb, one for Josie, and a rocking chair for Mara. He could hear the younger child stirring, calling softly for his mother, and then the older child's gentle reassurance. For the first time, Jonah felt the ache of solitude soften, tempered by the rhythm of their breathing. When dawn broke, it brought pale light drifting through the window. He emerged from his cot to find Mara already stirring hot water for coffee. Her hair was damp and tangled, but she managed a tired smile as she handed him a steaming cup. "Thank you," he said, tasting the bitter warmth that brought him back to life. Beside her, Caleb offered a half smile as he examined Jonah's well-worn boots. "Are you a hunter?" he asked, choking on excitement. Jonah nodded. "I hunt and gather what the forest gives me." He glanced at the window, where dustings of fresh snow lay undisturbed. "The storm keeps most away, but winter can be harsh for families with no shelter." Caleb's gaze widened. "We didn't mean to impose," he muttered. Mara placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "We are grateful, Jonah. Truly." Jonah simply nodded and took his bowl. "Come with me. I will show you where we get food." The children followed, pressing themselves close to his back as he fired up his old rifle and secured extra blankets around their shoulders. Together, the four of them stepped into the biting morning cold. Their first destination was a frozen creek that fed a small stand of evergreens. Jonah had noticed large footprints in the snow and tracked them here. "Deer," he explained quietly. He pointed to shallow indentations at the water's edge, where the animal had come to drink. "They'll come again." Hours later, they crouched behind a snow-laden cedar, breath visible in frosty clouds. Jonah taught Caleb how to steady the rifle, how to aim at the narrowing silhouette of a deer appearing at the creek, nose grazing the ice. But before he pulled the trigger, the deer bolted, hoofbeats drumming through the cold air. He let the shot pass and lowered the rifle. "We'll try again," he murmured. Caleb's disappointment was palpable, but Jonah's calm resolve soothed him. "Patience," he said, as though speaking to himself as much as the boy. "Winter teaches patience." They returned to the cabin at midday with empty hands but full hearts. Mara had prepared stew from dried beans and wild roots she had scavenged during the night. Its aroma welcomed them as they hung their scarves by the hearth. While they ate, Jonah's mind weighed the need to provide food, firewood, warmth, and the tension of not knowing how many days they would tarry. But the look in Mara's eyes, fierce with gratitude, and the shy hope in the children's faces, steeled his resolve. He would do what he could. Over the following days, Jonah guided Mara and her children through the rhythms of survival in the woods. He taught them where to find edible roots beneath the snow, how to listen for the subtle crack of ice that meant the creek was frozen too solid to drink. They learned to track rabbits along their winding snow-lashed paths, their tiny paws leaving neat impressions in the furrowed ground. Each day, Jonah's stern exterior softened more. He laughed when Caleb slipped on ice, picking himself up with a prideful grin, and he marveled at Josie's quiet courage as she held her breath beneath a branch to search for hidden berries, despite the risk of frost-bitten fingers. One evening, as the wind howled like a wounded beast outside, Jonah sat by the hearth, studying the parents he'd never had. Mara had fetched blankets to wrap around him, but he refused, pressing his cold hands against the mug of warmed milk she'd brought. He looked up to find her seated across from him, Josie nestled in her lap, Caleb leaning against his mother's leg. The children's faces were flushed pink from the fire, eyes bright with curiosity. "You've given us so much," Mara whispered, voice soft as falling snow. He swallowed. "It's nothing." Mara shook her head. "It's everything." She reached out and put a calloused hand over his. "You knew no one would come to help, but you did. You risked everything. You saved our lives." The heat of her gratitude brought tears to his eyes, and he turned his gaze to the dancing flames. Silence hung heavy until Josie's small voice broke through. "Mr. Woodsman?" He forced himself to look at her. "Yes, Josie." "Why do you live all alone?" Her innocent question echoed in his mind, stirring a longing he'd kept buried for years. He hesitated before replying. I thought I liked it that way." Josie lifted her chin, eyes shining with earnest. "But you have friends now, don't you? We're your friends." Caleb nodded vigorously. "Yeah, we help you, and you help us." He beamed at Jonah, and for the first time, Jonah felt warmth deeper than any fire could summon. It was the warmth of belonging. That night, as he lay in his cot, Jonah stared at the ceiling, the memory of Josie's question tugging at him. He recalled his childhood, being sent away to fend for himself when his parents died. He thought of the relentless solitude, the snow-covered nights with only his breath to keep him company. A single tear slid down his cheek, a rare leak in his armor. He had convinced himself that independence meant isolation, that to care was to be vulnerable. But Mara and her children had cracked his heart open, filling it with promise he never expected to feel again. The next morning, the world was washed in blinding white. Snow had piled high overnight, smoothing rough edges until the landscape looked like an endless sea of silk. Jonah dug out a narrow path to the woodpile, clearing enough logs for several days of fire. Mara and the children watched, wrapped in blankets, faces turned toward him. Jonah motioned for them to join him. Together they heaved logs onto a sled, Caleb's laughter echoing as the sled slid across the snow. Mara helped by tying the rope to her waist, pulling it with surprising strength. Jonah watched her, noticing how she moved with a quiet determination that mirrored his own. He felt a swell of pride and admiration he had never allowed himself to feel. Inside, as he stoked the fire, he saw Mara teach Caleb and Josie how to split kindling with a small hatchet. Their young faces were set in fierce concentration, lips pursed, brows furrowed as they each took careful turns. Jonah felt a fierce protectiveness, but he also felt something else: hope. Watching the children learn and laugh, he realized that he too was learning, about trust, about caring, about letting others in. Days turned into a rhythm of shared labor and shared joy. Jonah guided Mara as she built shelves to store grains in a corner, showing her how to fasten boards he had cut the day before. Caleb helped him mend a broken fence outside, hammering nails with an earnest attention that reminded Jonah of better days he thought he had lost forever. Josie, her cheeks rosy, gathered pine cones by the dozen, filling a basket to be used for kindling. At night, after the children had fallen asleep, with Caleb's soft breathing next to his own cot and Josie curled at Mara's feet, Jonah and Mara would sit by the dying embers, sipping watered-down wine he had stashed in the back room. They would speak in hushed tones about the past, about loss, about the fear that still shadowed them. One evening, Mara's voice trembled as she spoke of her husband, taken by fever last year, leaving her with 2 children and nowhere to go. Tears glistened in her eyes as she recalled the day she buried him beneath a thin veil of earth on a hill not far from the cabin. Jonas listened, feeling the weight of her grief settle in his chest like an anchor. He had never allowed himself to share his own grief, but now, in the soft glow of the embers, he found the words rising. He told her about his parents, the sickness that stole them, the long, brutal months he endured alone in the woods until he found this place and claimed it as his own. When he finished, his voice broke, and he looked at Mara for permission to cry. She offered none. Her tears were flowing freely already. In that moment, their barriers fell, not as 2 strangers bound by necessity, but as 2 wounded souls who found solace in each other's company. Their hands found each other across the small table, fingers entwining as though they were pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. No promise was spoken, none needed to be. The crackling fire filled the silence, a gentle reaffirmation that they were not alone. Winter deepened. Snow fell in thick curtains, obscuring the path back to civilization. Jonah ensured that their woodpile remained ample, that the children had enough school books and paper to practice writing by lamplight, and that Mara's days were filled with purpose, teaching the children and tending to chores that gave rhythm to their lives. Each night, With lamps lit and windows steamed, they gathered around the hearth to listen to Jonah's stories of the forest, how foxes navigated the drifted snow, how owls hunted in the darkness, how the moonlight turned the snow into diamonds. Caleb and Josie pressed close, eyes wide, imagining the world beyond the trees. One day, as Jonah prepared to leave for supplies, Mara's voice stopped him at the door. "Let me go with you," she said. He turned to see tears of determination glistening in her eyes. "I want to help." He hesitated. He knew how dangerous the trek could be. The forest was deceptively serene in winter, hiding ice-thin branches that snapped underfoot and crevasses concealed by drifts. "It's too dangerous," he insisted. "I'll be fine." "No," she said firmly, stepping toward him. "We're family now. We do this together." He looked into her face, lines prematurely etched by sorrow, yet softened by warmth, and felt a surge of admiration. Reluctantly, he nodded. "All right." They set out before dawn, the sky bruised in violet hues as they loaded provisions into a set of panniers. Caleb and Josie waved from the doorway, their breath forming small clouds that hovered before their faces. As Jonah led them along the familiar trail, the forest's hush enveloped them. But this time, he did not walk alone. He watched Mara's silhouette, sturdy and resolute, as she matched his pace through the drifted snow. At one point, the sled they had loaded veered into a shallow hole hidden beneath a layer of white. Mara's quick reflexes saved them. She grabbed the sled, preventing it from toppling and spilling their supplies. Jonah caught her gaze, gratitude and admiration flooding him. In her eyes, he saw the promise of spring, something he had never allowed himself to hope for. They reached a small settlement on the outskirts of the forest, a cluster of weathered cabins, smoke rising from their chimneys. Jonah had done business here in summers past, trading game hides and cedar logs for flour, sugar, and salt. But now, with Mara by his side, it felt different, like stepping into a new world where warmth and laughter were not alien. As they entered the dimly lit general store, the wooden floor groaned under their boots. The proprietor, a stocky man with a tangled beard, looked up from behind a counter cluttered with tin cans and flour sacks. His eyes narrowed at Jonah and Mara, then softened when he noticed the two children peering around their legs. "Jonah!" he rumbled, voice thick with surprise. "I haven't seen you since last spring." "Been busy," Jonah replied, sliding a pouch of deer hides onto the counter. "Got family now." He gestured to Mara and the children. The proprietor blinked, disbelief etched on his face. "Family," he echoed. The corners of his mouth turned upward in a slow smile. "Well, I'll be damned. Didn't peg you for the marrying type." His gaze shifted to Mara, who offered a shy nod. "Not married," she said gently. "Just, we found each other." Jonah saw the proprietor's eyes glisten with understanding, perhaps recalling his own losses, his own hard winters. The trade was swift. Flour, sugar, salt, and candles for long, dark nights, plus a small toy wooden horse for Caleb and a rag doll for Josie. As they turned to leave, the proprietor slipped a small loaf of sweet bread onto the counter. "For your wife," he said with a wink at Jonah. "She'll need more than ration biscuits in here." Jonah hesitated, but Mara took the loaf with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. And in that exchange, Jonah felt the warmth of community, a feeling so foreign it made his heart thunder. Back at the cabin, evening fell swiftly. Snowflakes drifted against the window panes like silent watchers. Jonah stacked the new supplies by the door while Mara set the table. The children clapped when they saw the bread, delight shining in their eyes as Josie sniffed its sweet aroma. That night, they feasted on thick slices drizzled with honey, washed down with warmed milk. Laughter bubbled around the small table as Jonah told a story about a mischievous raccoon that once stole his hat, an old tale he hadn't shared in years. Caleb laughed until tears formed at the corners of his eyes, and Josie clapped her hands in delight. Jonah looked at Mara, whose smile was brighter than the hearth's flame, and he felt as though his chest might burst with happiness. As winter's grip tightened, days bled into nights in a seamless blur of white. Jonah and Mara rose with the sun, the howl of the wind a constant reminder of the world's harshness beyond their door. They split firewood come dawn, exchanging glances of mutual respect when the day's tasks felt overwhelming. Mara's gentle presence buoyed Jonah's spirit, Her laughter became the music that staved off the darkness. Caleb and Josie thrived in this new world. They learned to identify animal tracks, to gather firewood, to bake with the flour Jonah had traded for. Each night they fell into bed exhausted but content. The steady rhythm of their breath, a lullaby that lulled Jonah into dreams he had once thought impossible. Then one gray afternoon, as Jonah was returning from a solo foray into the woods, he spotted a plume of smoke curling from the cabin's chimney that seemed thicker than usual. His heart tightened. When he neared, he saw the front door ajar, flames flickering in the small living room. Panic roared through him as he sprinted up the path, his boots slipping on icy ground. He hurled himself into the cabin, heat searing his lungs. The fire had leapt from the hearth to the curtains, and the entire front of the cabin was ablaze. "Mara!" he bellowed, fear jagging through each syllable. He grabbed a chair and smashed it against a window to let in fresh air and let the smoke out. The shrill crackling of the fire was deafening. He heard a gasp from the back room, Mara's voice. "Jonah, help!" He dropped to his knees, crawling through the choking haze, and found her guiding Caleb and Josie through a side door, soot smudging their faces, eyes wide with terror. He caught hold of Josie's mittened hand and pulled her to safety. Outside, they collapsed onto the snow, the cold air a cruel contrast to the fire's ferocity. Jonah glanced back at the cabin, seeing his home consumed by roaring flames that licked the sky. He felt hollowed by the sight but steeled himself. His family was safe. Mara wrapped her arms around the children, tears coursing down her cheeks. Caleb clung to her, and Josie buried her face in Jonah's chest, trembling. Jonah stared into the conflagration, each crackling ember an echo of every precious memory within those walls. The first night he had brought them home. Mara's soft laughter, the children's joyous cries, the flicker of hope that had taken root. He felt rage bubble up, then subside into a fierce determination. He must rebuild. Neighbors arrived, shouting warnings, forming a bucket brigade from the nearby stream. Jonah joined them, passing pails of icy water until the flames surrendered to embers, the cabin a charred skeleton. When the smoke cleared, the neighbors looked at Jonah and Mara with solemn sympathy. An elderly man stepped forward, a farmer from a few miles away. "Your cabin is gone, but you've got us," he said, placing a steady hand on Jonah's shoulder. "We'll build you a new home come spring." Jonah's throat tightened as he looked at Mara, who stood tall despite her tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She nodded, drawing the children close. In that moment, he realized that home was not timber and nails, but the bonds of love and community that held them together. Spring arrived, though the ground still bore patches of snow. Jonah led Mara and the children to the farmer's land, where a small crew of neighbors waited. They handed Jonah a blueprint for a larger cabin, sturdier, with space for everyone to live comfortably. It was a gift born of compassion and shared hardship. Jonah surveyed the open land where the cabin would stand, floodlit by stabs of sunlight that warmed his face. The children gleefully ran to inspect the foundation, their laughter a promise of better days. As the weeks passed, the cabin emerged from the earth. Walls of elm and oak rose, beams joined with precision, windows fitted so that spring light could pour in. Jonah worked tirelessly, driven by the memory of the fire and the determination to forge a new beginning. Mara gathered wildflowers, pressing them between heavy tomes to create keepsakes for the windowsills. Caleb helped carry planks, his small frame imbued with pride as he labored beside Jonah. Josie painted stones with bright colors, a rainbow of hope placed around the perimeter to ward off the lingering chill of winter's shadow. On a morning when the first robins returned and buds peeked through melted drifts, the cabin was complete. It stood firm and welcoming, not a simple shelter, but a testament to resilience, built by hands united in purpose. Jonah opened the door to find Mara standing behind him, Caleb and Josie at her side, each of them beaming. Light streamed through the windows, filling every corner with warmth. Jonah felt his chest expand with emotion so vast it threatened to overwhelm him. Here was his family, safe and whole. He lowered himself to one knee and looked at Mara. "Thank you," he whispered, voice thick with gratitude, "for trusting me, for staying, for everything." Mara knelt beside him, and they clasped hands, the children wrapping their arms around Jonah's neck. their laughter bubbling like a spring thaw. He hugged them all at once, feeling their small bodies press against him, their hearts beating in unison. In that embrace, he knew he would never be lonely again. They stepped inside together, and Jonah closed the door behind them. The cabin's interior was unfinished, simple planks for floors, bare walls, but to Jonah it was perfect. He set his tools aside and pulled a bolt of oak to the floor, then invited Caleb to join him. Jonah showed him how to sand the surface until it was smooth. Josie nestled at his feet, painting daisies around the edges. Mara arranged the wildflowers on a narrow windowsill, and their faces shone in the blossoming light. As evening fell, Jonah started a fire in the new hearth. The crackling logs sent plumes of smoke up the new chimney. He turned to see his family gathered around, faces flushed from the day's work, eyes bright with accomplishment. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine and sawdust and the promise of tomorrow. "We're home," he said, voice soft with wonder. The children cheered and Mara smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. Jonah built a sturdy fence around the garden, ensuring that no wandering deer would claim their hidden bounty. At night, they sat around the hearth, recalling the darkness they had endured. Nights when the forest seemed endless, the wind merciless. But now they had this, a safe haven filled with warmth and light. Jonah would tell stories of the forest, but now they were joined by Mara's tales of sunlit days in bustling towns, of laughter in a small bakery in a place he could barely imagine. Caleb and Josie would interrupt with questions, their voices pure and eager. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in swaths of rose and violet, Jonah took Mara into his arms outside. The air was still crisp, but the chill no longer bit as it once had. He pulled her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "I never believed I could feel this way again," he confessed, his breath a cloud in the cold air. "I thought my heart was frozen forever." Mara lifted her face to his, eyes glistening like stars. "You taught me that love never dies," she said. "It just waits for us to open our hearts." He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle press of lips that carried the weight of months spent building a life together. Snowflakes drifted around them, dusting their shoulders as if blessing their union. In that moment, Jonah felt something deep within him thawing completely. Hope, love, and the realization that he was no longer the lonely woodsman who wandered aimlessly. He had found purpose, family, and a love that would guide him through whatever storms lay ahead. Every morning, Jonah rose before dawn, slipping out to chop wood or tend to the animals they now kept. Chickens that clucked in the coop, a single goat that gazed at him with gentle brown eyes. His tasks were many, but each was a pleasure because he performed them for his family. Mara joined him whenever she could, her hands planting herbs for teas that warmed them through chilly evenings. Caleb learned to play the flute, its notes drifting across the clearing, and Josie danced barefoot through the daisies, laughter trailing like song. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and crimson, Jonah sat on the porch, Mara by his side, the children nestled between them. They watched the sun sink, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jonah placed an arm around Mara's shoulders, her head resting against him, and he felt a deep contentment settle in his bones. "I never expected you to change my life," he murmured. Mara looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the glow of the sunset. "We were meant to find each other," she said softly, "and we did." He smiled down at her, the warmth of her presence a balm to every wound he had carried. Despair had once been his constant companion, but in their love, he discovered something greater: purpose, community, and the knowledge that no one truly endured alone. The cold of winter had given way to the renewal of spring and the abundance of summer and autumn. Yet even as seasons shifted, the bond they had forged remained unbreakable. In the hush of that autumn evening, with the last light slipping away, Jonah closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He felt the steady pulse of life around him, Mara's gentle breathing, Caleb's soft flute melody drifting from inside, Josie's giggle at a joke he could not hear. He opened his eyes and looked at the world, the cabin standing strong against time, the forest, its branches reaching skyward, the wide expanse of sky, vast and unending. In that moment, Jonah understood that his life had been forever changed, first by the sharp sting of loneliness, then by the unexpected arrival of a widow and her children, and finally by the fierce, unwavering love they had shared. Their presence had thawed his frozen heart, and in return, he had given them shelter, hope, and a place to call home. The snow that once represented isolation and hardship now served as a memory of the transformative power of compassion and connection. He took Mara's hand, squeezing it gently, and nodded toward the cabin. "Let's go inside," he said. "It's a long night ahead." She smiled, slipping her fingers into his. Together they rose, and with Caleb and Josie by their side, they entered the cabin. Inside, the hearth awaited, its embers still warm. They gathered around it, and Jonah fetched the flute, handing it to Caleb, who played a soft lullaby. Josie hummed along, her voice pure and clear. Mara closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her, while Jonah watched, heart swelling. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the promise of the coming winter. But inside the cabin, amidst the glow of the hearth and the warmth of each other's presence, they faced the future unafraid. For they had learned that love could conquer even the harshest winters, and that even the loneliest woodsman could discover a family who would change his life forever.